The white silk of my wedding dress felt like a shroud as I stood before the man they called the Old Lion of the Valley. At 24, I was being traded to a billionaire duke 3 times my age to cover my father's gambling debts. My fiancé, the man I actually loved, stood in the front row, smirking as he pocketed the commission for arranging the match. I was homeless, pregnant with a child my family called a mistake, and sold to a stranger who barely looked at me. I expected a night of misery. I didn't know that 3 minutes into our wedding night, the Duke would lean in and whisper a truth that would turn my world upside down. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. To understand how I ended up on that altar, we have to go back to the day the eviction notice arrived. It was a Tuesday morning when the world stopped spinning. I was standing in the kitchen of our suburban home, staring at the bright yellow slip of paper taped to the front door. We lived in a neighborhood of manicured lawns and silent luxury, a place where people didn't get evicted. But my father's investments had finally caught up with us. The reality was much uglier. He had gambled away our legacy in underground poker rooms. We weren't just broke. We were about to be on the street. I felt the first wave of nausea, and it wasn't from the stress. I placed a hand over my stomach. I was 6 weeks pregnant. The father was Jason, my boyfriend of 3 years. He was a rising star in a local private equity firm, a man I thought was my anchor. I called him, my voice shaking as I told him we were losing the house. I told him about the baby, expecting him to tell me he'd take care of us. Instead, there was a long, cold silence on the other end of the line. When Jason finally arrived at our house that evening, he wasn't alone. He was with my father. They both looked at me not with concern, but with a calculated, business-like intensity. My father didn't apologize for losing our home. He told me he had found a solution. He called it a merger. He had reached out to Duke Sterling, a reclusive billionaire who lived in a fortress-like estate on the edge of the valley. Sterling needed a wife, and in exchange for my hand, he would wipe away every cent of my father's debt. I looked at Jason, pleading for him to stop this madness. But Jason stepped forward and took my hand. His touch, once warm, felt like ice. He told me that this was the only way. He whispered that we could still be together secretly, that the Duke was old and wouldn't live forever. He said I should think of it as a temporary sacrifice for our future and the baby. It was then that I realized Jason wasn't my protector. He was the one who had brokered the deal. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of humiliation. I was moved into the Sterling estate like a piece of high-end furniture being delivered for inspection. I was subjected to medical exams and legal briefings. Every time I saw Jason, he was discussing logistics with the Sterling lawyers. I felt my dignity being stripped away layer by layer. I was a human being, a woman with a life growing inside her, yet to them, I was just a contract signature. The wedding day was a public execution. The elite of the valley gathered to watch the old lion take a cub. My former friends whispered and laughed behind their lace fans, mocking the girl who was so desperate she'd marry a man 40 years her senior. I walked down the aisle with my head down, the weight of the billionaire story becoming a leaden burden on my shoulders. I felt the eyes of the crowd, but I only felt the smirk of Jason in the front row. He looked proud of the price he had fetched for me. The ceremony was a cold, clinical affair. Duke Sterling barely spoke. He didn't even look at me when he placed the ring on my finger. He was a shadow of a man, tall and imposing, but silent. As the guests cheered and the champagne flowed, I felt like I was drowning. I was a pregnant wife being handed over to a man I didn't know, sold by the man I thought I loved. The reception ended, and the Duke led me toward the grand staircase. The guests watched us go, their faces filled with pity or twisted amusement. I was terrified of what awaited me behind the heavy oak doors of the master suite. My mind was a whirlwind of escape plans and dark thoughts of the night to come. The Duke stepped into the room and closed the door, the heavy click of the lock sounding like a final judgment. He turned toward me, his eyes sharp and filled with a strange, piercing light. He walked closer until he was just inches away. The Duke didn't reach for my dress. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. His voice wasn't the gravelly growl I expected. It was soft, yet carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. He looked at my stomach and then back at my eyes, leaning in so close I could hear his steady breath. "I know Jason isn't who you think he is," the Duke whispered, and I think it's time you knew why I really bought your life today." Clara stood frozen as the heavy oak door clicked shut, the sound echoing like a final judgment. She expected the elderly billionaire to be a monster, a man who would demand his property after paying her father's massive gambling debts. Instead, Duke Sterling sat on the edge of a velvet armchair, his breathing shallow and labored. He didn't look at her with greed, but with a weary, piercing clarity. "I am not going to touch you, Clara," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "I am a dying man, and I have no interest in a trophy. I needed a wife with a soul, not a decoration." The room grew unnaturally quiet as the terror Clara had carried for weeks began to shift into confusion. Duke Sterling revealed that he was terminally ill, a secret he had guarded from his own siblings, who were circling his estate like vultures. He explained that his family was built on a foundation of malice, and he refused to let his legacy fund their cruelty. He needed a legal heir to protect his work, and he had been watching Clara long before Jason ever brokered the deal. He saw her once months ago, when she had quietly defended a colleague from being fired at her old firm. That one act of integrity was why she was here now. "You are pregnant," the Duke whispered, glancing at the subtle swell of her stomach. "And I know Jason is the father. I also know that he is the one who suggested this arrangement to your father so he could pocket a finder's fee." Clara felt her heart shatter all over again. To hear the Duke confirm that her love was nothing more than a transaction for Jason made the humiliation feel like a physical weight. The Duke offered her a partnership, a marriage in name only, complete legal protection, and a massive inheritance for her child. In exchange, she had to help him manage his affairs and keep his toxic family at bay during his final months. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, not from fear this time, but from the sudden, overwhelming sense of being seen as a person for the first time in years. This billionaire was not her predator. He was her only ally in a world that had tried to erase her. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, heavy brass key. His eyes held a flicker of something that looked like hope. "This key opens a safe in the library," he said, leaning in closer. "Inside is a dossier on Jason and your father that neither of them knows exists. It is the first step in taking your life back." Clara learned quickly that the Sterling estate was a gilded cage designed to keep the world out and secrets in. Her days were spent playing the part of the fragile, miserable trophy wife under the watchful eyes of the Duke's sister, Beatrice. To the outside world, Clara was a girl who had traded her soul for a paycheck. Beatrice and her brothers circled the Duke's study like vultures, counting his heartbeats and waiting for the moment they could claim the Sterling Empire. They treated Clara with a cold, sharp disdain, making sure she knew she was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience in their path to total control. The humiliation reached its peak when Jason and Clara's father attempted to visit the estate. They didn't come to check on her health or the baby's progress. They came to demand their first allowance from the marriage contract. Standing in the grand foyer, her father had the audacity to complain about the quality of his new apartment, while Jason winked at Clara, whispering that he missed her. He acted as though they were still partners in a long con, oblivious to the fact that Clara's soul had hardened into something he could no longer touch. She realized then that her family didn't just want the Duke's money. They wanted to drain Clara of her last drop of self-respect. The awakening happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Clara was retreating to the library, the one place she felt safe, when she heard voices echoing from a partially open side door. It was Jason and her older sister, Elena. The shock of seeing them together was one thing, but the words they exchanged were a jagged blade. Jason wasn't waiting for Clara to inherit a widow's portion. He and Elena had been having an affair for years. They had planned the entire debt crisis with her father to force Clara into this marriage. Their goal was simple: use Clara as a puppet to siphon off the Duke's wealth, then have her committed to a facility once the child was born so they could live together on the spoils. Clara leaned against the cold stone wall, her hand gripping her stomach as the baby kicked. The betrayal was total. It wasn't just about gambling debts or a business deal. Her entire life, her pregnancy, and her love had been weaponized against her by the people she shared blood with. Every ounce of guilt she had felt for her father's poverty vanished in a heartbeat. She looked down at the brass key the Duke had given her, feeling its heavy weight in her pocket. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was the only thing standing between these predators and the man who had actually offered her protection. As she watched them through the crack in the door, Jason leaned in to kiss Elena, his voice dropping to a sinister hum. He began detailing exactly how they would speed up the Duke's passing to ensure the inheritance hit the accounts before the quarterly audit. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear but with a cold, calculating rage. She turned away and hurried toward the library safe, knowing that the clock was now ticking. She reached for the safe's dial, but her hands froze when she heard Beatrice's voice calling her name from the hallway. Clara realized then that the predators weren't just outside her door, they were already inside the room with her. Clara retreated from the library door, her breath hitching in her throat. She had to warn the Duke immediately. The plan to speed up his passing wasn't just a threat. It was an active conspiracy between Jason and her own sister. She hurried toward the master suite, her hand clutching the brass key that now felt like her only lifeline. But when she burst into the room, she found the Duke's bed surrounded by machines that were beeping with a new, frantic urgency. His face was a ghostly shade of gray. His breathing was no longer just shallow, it was rattling. In the chaos, the Duke's primary physician, Eris, pushed Clara aside with a cold, dismissive glare. Clara watched in horror as he administered an injection that seemed to make the Duke's heart rate spike even more violently before he fell into a deep, unresponsive state. She remembered the hidden camera the Duke mentioned, but she couldn't see where it was. Panic flared as she realized the Duke's health had taken a genuine turn for the worse at the exact moment she discovered the plot. It felt too perfectly timed to be a coincidence. The situation spiraled before she could process the grief. Within an hour, Jason appeared at the estate, flanked by the Duke's sister, Beatrice. They didn't look like mourners, they looked like prosecutors. Jason pointed a finger at Clara, his face twisted into a mask of feigned outrage. He claimed he had found evidence in the kitchen, vials of unprescribed sedatives that matched the toxins found in the Duke's blood work. He told the gathered staff and the estate's security that Clara was neglecting and poisoning her elderly husband to secure the inheritance before the baby was born. Clara stood her ground, her hand resting on her stomach as she felt the baby kick in response to her soaring cortisol. She looked at Jason, seeing the monster behind the man she once thought she loved. The betrayal was so thick she could almost taste it. He was using her pregnancy against her, whispering to the security team that her hormonal instability made her dangerous and capable of anything. She was physically barred from the master suite, isolated in a cold guest wing while Dr. Eris, who Clara now knew was on Jason's payroll, signed a report stating the Duke was in a suspicious coma. The isolation was suffocating. Every servant looked at her with suspicion, and the local authorities were already on their way to the estate. Clara felt her reputation being systematically dismantled in a single afternoon. She was a homeless, pregnant widow to be in a mansion full of enemies. Just as she felt she might break under the pressure, she looked at the heavy brass safe in the library from across the hall. The predators thought they had trapped a lamb, but they didn't know the lion had left her the claws she needed to fight back. The front gates groaned open as a patrol car pulled into the driveway. Beatrice stepped toward Clara, a triumphant smirk on her face as she reached for her phone to make a call that would change everything. Clara realized then that the trap was closing, and the police weren't there to investigate a crime. They were there to arrest her for it. Clara stood in the center of the grand foyer as the red and blue lights of a patrol car splashed against the portraits of sterling ancestors. The police didn't come with questions. They came with handcuffs. Jason stood behind the officers, wearing a mask of practiced grief that made Clara's skin crawl. He whispered to the sergeant about her deteriorating mental state and how her hormonal instability had turned into a homicidal obsession with the Duke's fortune. Beatrice stood beside him, nodding solemnly, playing the role of the protective sister to perfection. They were using the very legal system Clara had once respected to bury her alive. The preliminary hearing was a public nightmare designed to strip Clara of her remaining dignity. Because she couldn't afford a high-powered defense team on her own, she sat at the respondent's table with only the manila folder the Duke had guided her toward. Jason testified first, painting himself as the concerned ex-fiancé who had only wanted to save Clara from her own unstable nature. He looked at the judge with tearful eyes, claiming Clara had been secretly dosing the Duke with unprescribed sedatives to speed up her inheritance. Every lie felt like a physical blow, leaving Clara breathless in the crowded courtroom. The prosecution weaponized her pregnancy, suggesting that her desperation to secure a future for a mistake child had driven her to elder abuse. The gallery murmured with disdain, and for a moment, Clara felt herself shrinking, folding into the small, manageable shape they wanted her to be. But then, she remembered the Duke's rasping voice in the dark. Integrity isn't for the good times. It's the only thing you own when you have nothing else. She realized that waiting for justice wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate test of her resolve. The turning point came just as the judge prepared to rule on Clara's fitness as a guardian. Clara looked at Jason, who was smirking at his designer cufflinks, convinced he had finally won. He didn't know that the Duke's coma was the final piece of a forensic trap. The Duke had faked the unresponsive state to let the predators reveal their true faces on a hidden recording device Jason had never noticed. Clara took a deep breath and handed a single flash drive to the court clerk. The room went deathly silent as the judge plugged the drive into her laptop. Jason's smirk didn't just fade. It vanished as he realized the woman he dismissed as nothing was the only one who truly understood the game. As the judge's expression shifted from skepticism to glacial fury, a loud notification chimed from the clerk's desk. A new video file had just been authorized for public record, and it didn't just contain a confession. The judge looked up from the screen, her eyes locking onto Jason with the intensity of a predator, and asked a question that made the entire courtroom gasp. Judge Williams adjusted her glasses, her eyes fixed on the screen, where the video file played with startling clarity. The footage didn't show Clara harming anyone. Instead, it captured Jason and Elena standing in the Duke's private study 2 nights ago, their voices dripping with greed as they discussed the final dosage. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop as Jason's recorded voice bragged about how he had manipulated Clara's father into debt just to set this merger in motion. He spoke of Clara not as a partner, but as a disposable asset whose only value was her signature on the inheritance papers. Jason's face drained of color as the video shifted to a secondary angle, revealing Elena laughing as she held a blue glass vial identical to the ones Jason had tried to plant in Clara's room. The evidence of a coordinated conspiracy was irrefutable. Jason looked toward his high-powered counsel, but even his own lawyer began to push his chair away, distancing himself from the rot now exposed to the public record. Clara sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her stomach, feeling a wave of healing pride as she realized she had finally defended her own dignity. She wasn't the naive girl they had mocked. She was the one who had finally caught the predators in their own trap. The judge looked up from the monitor, her expression one of glacial fury as she addressed the room. "Mr. Brightwell," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. "You stood in my courtroom and accused this pregnant woman of elder abuse while you were actively plotting a homicide for financial gain." She immediately ordered the bailiffs to secure the exits, preventing Elena, who was slipping toward the back of the gallery, from leaving. The old lion had indeed faked his decline, and through Clara, he was now delivering a judgment Jason never saw coming. As the police approached Jason with real handcuffs this time, he let out a jagged, desperate laugh, still trying to spin a lie about context. But the forensic evidence was already being uploaded to the district attorney's office in real time. Clara stood slowly, her spine straight for the first time in months. She watched the man who had sold her being led away, realizing that the inheritance the Duke promised wasn't just about money. It was about the power to choose who belonged in her life. However, just as the bailiffs reached for Jason, he lunged toward the clerk's desk, shouting a name that made Clara's blood turn to ice. The courtroom erupted as Jason grabbed a heavy manila folder from the desk, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He didn't point it at Clara. He pointed it at the Duke's sister, Beatrice, who had been sitting silently in the front row. "You think I'm going down alone?" he screamed, his voice cracking with a terrifying revelation. "Ask her whose idea the debt really was." Beatrice didn't move, but the sudden, sharp sound of the Duke's machines flatlining from the speaker system upstairs echoed through the courtroom, stopping everyone in their tracks. The piercing wail of the flatline monitor echoed through the courtroom speakers, a chilling sound that seemed to freeze time itself. Clara gripped the wooden railing of the respondent's table, her heart hammering against her ribs as the reality of the sound set in. Duke Sterling, the man who had offered her a shield when her own blood had traded her for a commission, was gone. Across the aisle, Jason's wild eyes flicked from the judge to Beatrice, a jagged, desperate laugh escaping his lips even as the bailiffs closed in. He shook the manila folder he had snatched, screaming that Beatrice had been the true architect of the gambling debts that had buried Clara's father. Beatrice Sterling stood slowly, her cream-colored suit reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights, her face a mask of stone-cold calculation. She didn't look at Jason. She looked at Clara with a disdain so sharp it felt physical. "My brother is dead," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the rising murmurs of the gallery like a blade. "And with him, your little protection experiment dies too. This estate belongs to the Sterling bloodline, not a homeless girl and her mistake." The room erupted in chaos as reporters scrambled for their phones, sensing the collapse of a billion-dollar legacy. Clara felt a wave of nausea, the weight of the Duke's brass key in her pocket feeling like a leaden anchor in a storm. Through the noise, Clara's older sister, Elena, tried to slip past the court officers, her face pale with the realization that the forensic trap had already closed around her. But the judge's gavels slammed down with a deafening crack that silenced the room. "No one leaves this courtroom," Judge Williams commanded, her expression one of glacial fury as she stared down Beatrice. The judge pointed to the screen where the video file was still paused on a shot of the blue glass vial. "The Duke anticipated your greed, Miss Sterling. He didn't just leave a wife. He left a dossier that is being unsealed by the district attorney's office this very second." Clara looked at Jason, seeing him finally broken, his expensive suit hanging off him like a shroud as the officers forced his hands behind his back. The healing didn't come from the money he had failed to steal, but from the sudden, profound realization of her own self-respect. She was no longer a puppet in their long con. She stood tall, one hand protective over her child, realizing that the Duke's final act wasn't just revenge. It was a lesson in healthy boundaries and the courage to stand alone against a family built on malice. Just then, the clerk's computer chimed again with an urgent, high-priority email from the Sterling Estate's main server. The clerk whispered something into the judge's ear, her eyes wide with shock. Judge Williams looked at Clara, then back at the legal documents in front of her, her jaw tightening. "It seems," the judge said slowly, her voice echoing through the stunned silence, "that the Duke's passing triggered a specific codicil in his will regarding the unborn child." Beatrice's confident facade finally shattered into 1,000 pieces as the judge revealed the one condition that would strip the Sterling siblings of every cent of their inheritance. The air in the courtroom felt like lead as Judge Williams began to read the unsealed codicil. Beatrice Sterling sat like a statue, but her hands were trembling so violently they rattled the pearls at her neck. The judge's voice was clear and unforgiving. "Duke Sterling has stipulated that in the event of his death, the entirety of the Sterling family trust, including all real estate and international holdings, shall be held in a primary guardianship for his unborn heir." The room seemed to tilt as the judge continued. "The Duke's siblings are to be immediately removed from all board positions and provided only a minimal, flat stipend, contingent upon their absolute lack of interference with the widow, Clara Sterling." Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. She turned her fury toward Clara, but the bailiffs were already stepping between them, forming a wall of blue uniforms. Clara didn't shrink away this time. She stood tall, one hand resting on the life growing inside her, feeling a profound sense of self-respect. She realized that the Duke hadn't just given her money. He had given her the ultimate tool to enforce healthy boundaries against people who viewed human beings as property. The weight of the inheritance was no longer a burden, but a shield for her child's future. Across the aisle, Jason was being forced into a chair, his face a mask of pathetic desperation as the detectives began documenting the evidence of his fraud. He tried to catch Clara's eye, mouthing a plea for forgiveness. But she looked through him as if he were made of glass. She saw the old lion's brilliance now. He had known that only a woman who had suffered at the hands of these vultures would have the heart to protect his legacy from them. The commission Jason had pocketed was now his own death sentence in the eyes of the law. The judge then turned her attention to the manila folder Jason had dropped. She leafed through the pages, her brow furrowing as she looked at Beatrice once more. "This folder contains more than just debt records." "Sterling," the judge said, her voice dropping to a dangerous level. "It contains transcripts of encrypted messages between you and a private investigator regarding the systematic poisoning of your own brother." The gallery erupted in a roar of shock. Clara felt the floor of her reality shift again. She looked at the brass key, still clutched in her hand, realizing the library safe held one final secret she hadn't reached yet. She turned toward the exit, needing to get back to the estate, but a sharp, sudden pain in her abdomen made her stumble. As the bailiffs rushed toward her, Clara realized the stress of the reckoning had finally pushed her body to its limit. The baby was coming, and it was 3 weeks too early. The searing pain in Clara's abdomen didn't just signal the arrival of her child. It signaled the total collapse of the world she had been forced to inhabit. As she slumped against the respondent's table, gasping for air, the courtroom transformed from a battleground of legal jargon into a scene of frantic human urgency. Judge Williams was on her feet instantly, her voice cutting through the rising chaos of the gallery. She ordered an immediate medical escort, her earlier glacial fury replaced by a sharp protective concern for the woman who had just dismantled a dynasty. Clara felt the cold tile of the floor against her palm as she went down, but her grip on the brass key never loosened. It was the only tangible thing she had left of the man who had truly tried to save her. Jason tried to take a step toward her, his face a twisted mask of feigned husbandly panic, but the bailiff slammed him back into his chair with a force that rattled the wooden frame. They knew. The entire room now knew. The detective standing by the door blocked Jason's view of Clara, a silent barrier against the man who had viewed her as nothing more than a commission check. Clara looked up through a blur of tears and saw her sister, Elena, being cornered by 2 officers near the jury box. There was no pity left in Clara's heart, only a cold, stabilizing realization of her own worth. She had defended her dignity, and now she had to defend her life. The ride to Mercy General was a strobe light of blue and red, the siren a high-pitched scream that matched the pulsing rhythm of her contractions. Clara lay on the gurney, one hand protectively shielding the life inside her, the other clutching her phone as it vibrated with constant, ignored notifications. Every bump in the road felt like a physical reminder of the red flags she had ignored for years, the small, practiced lies Jason told, the way her father had avoided her eyes, the cold distance of the Sterling family. But the fog was gone now. She was no longer a victim waiting for a predator to strike. She was a mother arriving at her own reckoning. In the delivery room, the lavender scent of the air was a cruel echo of the clinic where her nightmare began, but the hands that guided her now were those of professionals who saw her as a human being, not a contract signature. Clara refused to let the pain break her focus. She demanded the presence of the Sterling estate's private security, the ones the Duke had vetted himself, to guard the door. She knew Beatrice was still out there, her inheritance stripped away by a child she considered a mistake. For the first time, Clara understood that setting boundaries wasn't about building a cage. It was about building a fortress for the only family that mattered. Hours bled into a haze of sweat and iron, but just as the sun began to rise over the city, a new sound filled the room, a thin, reedy cry that carried the weight of a billion-dollar legacy and the strength of a woman who had survived the impossible. The nurse placed a tiny wriggling bundle on Clara's chest, and the silence that followed was the first true peace she had known in months. Clara looked down at her daughter, seeing the old lion's fierce spirit in the baby's dark, curious eyes. The battle in the courtroom was won, but the real war for the Sterling Empire was just beginning. As Clara finally drifted into a light, exhausted sleep, her hand brushed the nightstand where the brass key sat. She didn't know that back at the estate, the library's safe had already been accessed by someone who didn't need a key. The heavy door of the vault swung open silently, revealing not just deeds or dossiers, but a final handwritten letter from the Duke addressed to the one person he knew would never betray him. Clara's phone, lying forgotten on the hospital floor, lit up with a single encrypted message from the estate's main server. The message wasn't a legal update or a bank transfer. It was a live video feed from the Duke's private study, showing a shadow moving through the darkness toward the master suite, and the person wasn't a sibling or a lawyer. Clara sat in the quiet of the Sterling master suite, the rhythmic hum of the hospital machinery finally silenced. Duke Sterling had passed away at dawn, a small, peaceful smile lingering on his face. He died, knowing his vast legacy was no longer at the mercy of vultures, but in the hands of a woman whose character had been forged in the hottest of fires. Clara looked down at the Duke's final, handwritten letter, her fingers tracing the elegant script as her newborn daughter slept soundly in a basset beside her. The old lion had saved his most startling revelation for the very end. The letter revealed that the Duke had known Jason was a predator from the very first day. He had watched Jason manipulate Clara's father into debt, waiting for the young man to reveal the full extent of his greed. The Duke wrote that he hadn't been looking for a wife to serve him, but for a partner to help him clean up the valley before he left this world. He knew that only someone who had been treated like a disposable asset would have the fire to protect the vulnerable. He had chosen Clara because he saw a strength in her that she hadn't yet recognized in herself, a dignity that no auction price could ever truly touch. Today, the Sterling estate has been transformed from a cold fortress of secrecy into the headquarters of the Sterling Foundation. Clara serves as the head of the organization, systematically dismantling the predatory lending networks that once held her family hostage. The billions that were meant to be Jason's commission are now funding humanitarian work across the state, providing legal aid and housing for women who have been silenced by power. Every contract signed under her leadership is a testament to family responsibility and the heavy weight of integrity. Jason and Beatrice are gone from her world, facing a long, cold reckoning in federal custody for their conspiracy and fraud. They are living with the consequences of their choices, while Clara is finally living for herself. The healing wasn't just in the revenge. It was in the spiritual liberation of realizing that her worth was never something to be negotiated. She has built a life defined by healthy boundaries and the fierce, protective love of a mother who refused to stay broken. Clara stood on the grand balcony of the estate, the evening sun painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. She held her daughter close, feeling the steady heartbeat of the next generation of Sterlings against her chest. The air was clear, the silence was no longer heavy with fear, and the future felt like a wide-open horizon. She had risen from the ashes of a bitter vow to become the architect of her own peace. Clara turned her auction price into a price of freedom for hundreds. Her journey reminds us that inspirational stories often begin in the darkest places, leading to an emotional realization that changes everything. If you believe every person deserves respect regardless of their bank account, hit the like button and comment dignity below. Let us know your thoughts on Clara's transformation, and stay tuned for more stories of resilience and justice.